sun went down behind the tree line the way it always did in October, without much color, just a slow fading of light from the western sky, until the fields went gray and the barn became a black shape against what remained of the day. Eldon Marsh stood at the edge of his porch and watched it go. He had a cup of cold coffee in his hand that he did not drink. He had made it that morning and forgotten it, and now it was just something to hold. The farm was 41 acres of river bottom land in Bracken County, Kentucky, 7 miles above the town of Augusta. The land was good when the water didn't take it. Some years, the spring floods came up over the lower field and left silt and debris along the fence lines. And those years, the corn came in thin and pale. Other years, the land was exactly what his father had said it was when he bought it in 1889, dark and rich and willing. This year had been neither good nor bad. The corn was adequate. Adequate was not enough. He set the coffee cup on the porch railing and went inside. The house was 2 rooms downstairs and 1 up. He had lived alone in it for 2 years, since his wife, Ruth, died of a fever in the late summer of 1925. Before that, she had been in it for 23 years, and the house still had the shape of her. The curtains she'd sewn from feed sacks, the kitchen table set at an angle to catch the morning light, the single shelf of books above the fireplace that he never read but never moved. He had not rearranged anything. He did not see the point. He ate standing at the counter. Bread and cold beans from the pot he had not bothered to reheat. When he was done, he put the plate in the dry sink and looked at the tin clock on the shelf above the stove. It was 7:15. He had until 9:30, maybe 10, to get the boat loaded and on the water. He went to the back room to change his shirt. His left eye was glass. Had been since 1901, when a corn husker threw back a cob and took the real one. The glass eye was a shade lighter than the right, a pale brown against the dark. And people who met him for the first time sometimes couldn't say what was wrong, only that something was. He had long since stopped thinking about it. The eye did not bother him. The debt did $340. Due to the First Farmers Bank of Augusta on the 15th of December. He had 112 in the tin under the bedroom floorboard, corn he could sell, and nothing else except the land itself, which was the thing he was trying to keep. Tonight, he would carry 12 gallons of whiskey across the Ohio River. He went out the back door and into the dark. The cellar was under the back of the house, reached through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor that sat flush with the boards when shut. You had to know it was there to find it. Eldon had built it himself in the spring of 1924. The first year, he had decided to do what he was now doing regularly. He was not proud of the trapdoor. He was not ashamed of it either. It was a practical thing, like a good latch on a gate. He went down with the lantern kept low. The cellar smelled of earth and old wood, and the sharp, clean smell of whiskey that had been aging in crocks against the far wall. He had 12-gallon jugs, sealed with wax-covered corks, each wrapped in burlap. He had made the whiskey himself over the past 6 weeks in a copper. Still, he kept disassembled in the barn loft. He was not a drinking man. He had not been one since his 20s. He made the whiskey the way a man makes something he is good at and that other people want, without moral sentiment in either direction, and with care for the craft. He checked each cork. He lifted each jug by the neck and held it to the lantern. The whiskey was amber and clear. It was better than what you could get from the druggist with a medicinal prescription, and better than most of what the speakeasies in Cincinnati were serving. He knew this because Garver had told him so, and Garver had no reason to flatter him. He blew out the lantern and sat for a moment in the dark of the cellar with the 12 jugs around him. He was not praying. He was not thinking anything particular. He was sitting with what he was about to do before he went and did it. This was a habit he had developed without naming it. You look at the thing first. Then you do it. He got up and started carrying the jugs up the stairs one at a time. He loaded the jugs into the wagon bed 2 at a time, settling them into a nest of old horse blankets spread across the boards to keep them from knocking together. The mule, a gray animal named Cobb, 15 years old and not easily excitable, stood in the traces without moving while he worked. Cobb had made this trip before. The mule understood it would happen, and then it would be over, and there would be water and grain at the end. The night was cold and clear. There was no moon yet. The stars were out in numbers that suggested hard frost, but the air was only cool. The river kept the valley above freezing longer than the upland farms. He could smell the river from here, a quarter mile through the bottom timber. That low mineral smell of moving water over limestone and mud that he had known his whole life. He checked the hitch and walked to the head of the mule and ran his hand down the animal's nose. The mule pressed its nose briefly against his palm and looked away. He climbed onto the seat and took the reins and turned the wagon off the barnyard and down the track into the timber. He did not take the main lane. He took the old wood track his father had cut through the bottom timber in the early years, a track that ran to the river through a stand of sycamore, and cottonwood thick enough to hide a man with a wagon if the man moved slowly and did not use a lamp. He moved slowly. He did not use a lamp. Wheels made almost no sound on the soft, wet earth of the track. Cobb's hooves were quiet. The timber closed around them, and the stars were gone, and there was only the dark and the smell of the river getting stronger with every minute. He had driven this track so many times now that his hands knew it. Not knew it in the way of thinking, but in the way of the body, the slight lean to the left at the stand of old cottonwoods, the dip where the spring ran across the track in wet weather. He did not need to see it. He knew it in the dark, the way he knew the dimensions of his own kitchen. The mule picked its way down the slope, and the timber opened, and there was the river. The bank where he kept the boat was a place he had found by accident 3 years ago. A cut in the high river bank where a big sycamore had fallen, and the roots had pulled out, leaving a shelf of flat earth at the water's edge, screened from the river by a tangle of downed wood and willow growth. From the water, you would not know it was there. He had arranged the fallen branches into better order that first fall, and he had kept the flat-bottomed boat there ever since under a canvas, the color of river mud. He stopped the wagon at the top of the bank and unhitched Cobb and tied the mule to a sycamore. He went down on foot first to check the water. The Ohio was running at a good level, dark and moving, with a slight chop in the middle where the current was strongest. He could see the Ohio shore as a dark line against the slightly less dark sky. No lights, no boats he could make out. He went back up and started carrying the jugs down the bank one at a time. It was steep going, and the earth was slick with fallen leaves, and he took it carefully, feeling for each step. He was not a young man. He could not afford to fall with a gallon jug of whiskey and break his leg on the riverbank at night with 12 more jugs to go and $340 owed to bank. He loaded the boat from the stern, setting the jugs low in the hull, centered fore and aft so the trim would be even. 6 trips up the bank and back. When the last jug was in, he stood and breathed. His back ached in the familiar place. He straightened slowly. He pulled the canvas off the oars. He untied the bowline and coiled it and set it in the bow. He pushed the boat out from the shelf into the current and stepped in and took the oars. The river took him. He had expected that and did not fight it. He let the current carry him broadside for a moment while he found his bearing, then turned the bow toward the Ohio shore and began to row. Long, even strokes, blades kept low, no splashing. The sound of oars in dark water travels farther than most people think. The river was wide here, nearly a mile from bank to bank at the Kentucky shore. The current was heavier in the middle third, and that was where you had to work. He worked steadily, not hurrying, keeping his breathing even. He was a big man in the shoulders, and his arms were still good after 30 years of farm work. The rowing did not trouble him. What troubled him was the open water and the time it took to cross it. Stars were reflected in the river in broken pieces, scattered and shifting with the current. He watched the Ohio shore line up across the bow and kept it there. He had no compass and did not need one. He knew where he was going. The night was very quiet except for the water and the creak of the oarlocks. Somewhere behind him, back on the Kentucky shore, a screech owl called once and was quiet. The sound carried out over the water, and then the river took it away. He thought about nothing. This was a skill he had developed over years. When you are doing something that requires attention and cannot be undone, thinking about other things is a kind of waste. The work was crossing the river with 12 jugs of whiskey in the dark without being seen. That was all of it. He applied himself to it. He was perhaps 200 yards from the Kentucky shore when he thought he saw a light upstream. He stopped rowing and let the oars trail and watched. Nothing. The river moved him downstream. He watched the upstream dark for 20 seconds and then took up the oars again. A reflection. The river made illusions. He was familiar with them. He rowed. The Ohio shore grew slowly darker and more defined against the sky. The bank manager's name was Cordell Haynes. He was 38 years old and had come down from Cincinnati in 1921 to run the Augusta branch of First Farmers. He wore suits too good for Augusta and had the manner of a man who believed that being careful with other people's money entitled him to a certain coldness in his personal dealings. Eldon did not dislike him. He disliked the arithmetic Haynes represented. He had gone in to see Haynes in September with his hat in his hands, not literally, but close enough, and explained the situation with the crop price and asked about an extension. Haynes had listened without expression and opened Eldon's file on his desk and gone through it with a fountain pen, not looking up for a long time. When he did look up, he said the bank could not offer an extension at this time, that the terms of the note were clear, and that if the note was not paid in full by December 15th, the bank would be forced to begin proceedings. He said it the way a man reads from a card. Eldon had asked what proceedings meant in practical terms. Haynes said it meant the bank would seek to recover the property, used as collateral, Eldon said. The farm, Haynes said. Yes. Eldon put his hat back on and stood up and thanked Haynes for his time and walked out onto the main street of Augusta and stood in the September sun for a while. The river was 2 blocks away. He could smell it. He had been smelling that river his whole life. He thought about what it would mean to not smell it anymore, to be somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't this particular piece of ground, on this particular bend of the Ohio. He could not fully imagine it. He had tried. He always failed. He got in his wagon and drove home and went down to the cellar and started thinking about what he had in Crocs. The arithmetic of Cordell Haynes could be countered with different arithmetic. It was not Eldon's preferred method. It was the method available. The fog found him in the middle of the river. It came off the water the way it always did in October, rising from below, thin at first and then thicker, muffling the star reflections and making the air taste of cold water and wet stone. He could still see the Ohio shore as a dark line, but it was softer now, less certain. He kept his bearing on a single darker shape on the far bank, a stand of big cottonwoods he had lined himself up with before the fog came in. He rowed toward them. His brother Dale had drowned in this river in 1908. Not here, 11 miles upstream, near Germantown, where the river bent hard, and the current ran against a limestone shelf that sat just below the surface in high water. Dale had been 27. He had been crossing in a small skiff to visit a woman on the Ohio side, which was a thing their mother had never known, and Eldon had never told anyone. It was a fact he carried alone. He did not think about Dale often, but the fog on the river brought him back the way certain smells do, suddenly and completely, so that for a moment the past and the present occupied the same space. Dale had been the better looking of the two of them. Charming in a way Eldon had never managed. Women had liked him unreasonably. He had laughed easily. He had died in cold water in the dark, going to see a woman whose name Eldon had never known. Eldon had stood at the Germantown bank with their father and watched them drag the river with poles, and felt something close up in him that had not fully opened since he rowed. The fog was all around him now, and the shore was just a shape in it. He could hear the water under the hull, the particular sound of current changing, and he read it the way you read a known face, without having to think about what you are reading. He was more than halfway across. He heard the steamboat before he saw it. A deep, regular throb in the water that he felt through the hull before his ears picked it up. He stopped rowing immediately and shipped the oars into the boat and lay flat against the jugs in the hull, one hand on each gunwale. The steamboat was downstream, moving upstream, coming toward him. Its running lights appeared first as smears of color in the fog, red to port and green to starboard, and then the white masthead light above, and then the dark shape of the hull itself. A small packet steamer, maybe 80 feet, running light and high in the water. Its course would take it past him at perhaps 60 yards if he did not move. He did not move. The boat went by with its engine thumping, and the stern churning, and the wash coming out in slow, deep rolls that lifted his boat and set it down again. He could see a man in the pilot house, silhouetted against the light inside, and another man on the aft deck smoking, his back to the river, looking at nothing particular. Neither looked his way. There was no reason for them to look his way. He was a dark shape in dark water and fog. The steamer passed. Its lights went ahead into the fog. The engine sound faded. He lay in the bottom of the boat for another full minute after the last sound was gone, listening to nothing, feeling the wash diminish under him. Then he sat up and took the oars and found his bearing and began to row again. His heart was not racing. He had expected something of this kind. The river had traffic at all hours, and he had learned that the best response to most things on water was stillness and patience. A moving man draws the eye. A still man on dark water is almost nothing at all. He was near the Ohio shore. He could see the cottonwoods clearly now. Ruth had disliked the river. This was a thing she had never said directly, but that Eldon had understood from the first year of their marriage, when she had walked with him down to the bank one evening and looked at the water for a long time without speaking, then turned and walked back to the house. She was from the upland country, from a farm near Flemsburg, where the Ohio was not visible from any window. The river was not in her. She had been a good woman and a good wife, and he had loved her in the practical, daily way that marriage produces if you are fortunate, not the love of courtship, which burns differently and does not last in the same form, but the love made of small consistencies, of knowing how someone takes their coffee, what makes them tired, where they carry their worry. She carried hers in her jaw. When she was worried, she set it square and tight, and he had learned to read it like weather and to adjust accordingly. She died of a fever in late August of 1925. 9 days sick, the doctor twice, and then gone on a Sunday morning before the sun was fully up. He had been with her. She had not been conscious for the last day and a half, and so there had been no last words. He had heard this was common. The world was not arranged for last words. The world was arranged for the living, and the dying to get on with their respective occupations without much ceremony. He had buried her in the Augusta churchyard and come home and planted the fall wheat and not gone anywhere for a long time afterward. He thought about her sometimes when he was on the water. Not from any clear reason, just the dark and the cold and the moving river and her there in his mind for a while, and then gone, the way she was gone, without warning, and then completely. The Ohio shore was close now. He could hear the gravel bar. The shore came up on him slowly out of the fog. He saw the cottonwoods first as dark masses, then the line of the bank below them, then the water shoaling at the edge. He slowed and let the bow come around, and used one oar as a rudder to steer toward the cove. The cove was 50 yards upstream from the cottonwood stand, a place where a gravel bar curved out from the bank and created a quiet backwater behind it. He had found it on his first crossing in the spring of 1925 and had used it every time since. You could pull a flat-bottom boat up onto the gravel bar in the dark, and it would sit quiet and level, screened from the river channel by the bar itself. Anyone passing on the water would not see it. He smelled the city before he heard anything of it. Cincinnati was 8 miles downstream, and you could not see it from here. But on a still night, you could smell it, coal smoke and river industry, and something harder to name, the smell of close-packed human life. He had been to Cincinnati 3 times. He had not liked it. Too large and too loud, and moving at a pace that exhausted him just to remember. But he was not going to Cincinnati tonight. He was going 50 yards past the gravel bar to a stand of willow where a man named Garver would be waiting. He ran the bow up onto the gravel bar gently and stepped out into 3 inches of cold water and pulled the boat up by the bowline until it was secure. He stood still and listened. The Ohio shore was quiet. No voices. No movement in the willows. He checked the inside of his coat where he kept the folded paper with the agreed price written in pencil. He reached in and felt it. He waited. He waited 20 minutes. He stood beside the boat on the gravel bar with his back against the hull and his hands in his coat pockets, and listened to the river behind him and the Ohio shore in front. An owl was working the timber somewhere to his left. He heard it twice, unhurried, and then it stopped. Waiting was not difficult for him. He had spent much of his life waiting, for weather, for crops, for prices, for the river to do what rivers do. A man who farms learns to wait in the body, not just in the mind. You let the time pass through you instead of against you. This is the thing that men raised in cities cannot do, or cannot do easily, because they have been taught that time is a resource not to be wasted. Eldon had been taught differently. Time is weather. You do not argue with it. You dress for it and go out in it and do your work. He thought about the money. $30 if Garver held to the agreed price. $30 added to what he had would leave him still short by nearly $200. He had known this before he came. The $30 was not the solution. It was a piece of the solution. The rest of it he would have to find through other means, selling the mule perhaps, or taking contract work at the tobacco warehouses in Brooksville through November. He did not want to sell the mule. Cobb was old and slow but useful, and he did not know what he would get for it at the autumn sale in Augusta. Not much. Not enough to make selling him pleasant. He turned these things over without urgency. The arithmetic was familiar to him. He had been turning it over for months. A light appeared in the willows. Dim amber. A lantern with holes punched in a tin can around it, letting out just enough light to navigate by, and no more. He straightened up and moved toward it. Garver was a short man, heavy through the middle, with a face that was hard to read in good light and impossible in the kind of light they were using now. He wore a canvas coat and a hat pulled low, and he moved carefully on the gravel bar, watching his footing. He was not from the river. He was from Newport, Kentucky, which was close enough to smell it, but far enough to still find it unpredictable. They did not shake hands. They had done this enough times that formalities had become unnecessary. 12. Garver said 12. Garver set the lantern on the gravel and crouched and pulled back the canvas on the nearest jugs and lifted one by the neck and uncorked it and smelled it without tasting it. He recorked it and did the same with a second jug from the middle of the load. This was his practice, and Eldon let him do it without comment. Same as last time, Garver said. Same. Garver stood and reached inside his coat and came out with a fold of bills. He counted them in the lantern light, a mix of 2s and 1s, and held them out. Eldon took them and counted them himself. $30 even. I've got a buyer in Newport asking about regularity, Garver said. He wants to know if you can do this monthly. Eldon folded the bills and put them in his inside coat pocket. I can do it when I can do it, he said. Monthly is a schedule. I don't work on a schedule. Garver nodded as if this was the answer he had expected. I'll tell him it's when I can get it. That's the truth of it. They did not talk after that. Garver moved the jugs from the boat to the bank one at a time, stacking them against a cottonwood root. When the last jug was out, he covered the stack with a canvas and weighted the edges with stones. He was a careful man. This was why Eldon had continued to deal with him. River's running easy tonight, Garver said. Easy enough, Eldon said. Garver picked up his lantern and went back into the Willows without looking back. Eldon stood alone on the gravel bar in the dark and listened to the water. He counted the money again in the dark by feel. He knew how bills feel when they are right. The weight and texture of paper money is specific, and a man who handles cash rarely enough that each bill means something learns to know it with his fingers, the way a blind man knows a face. He counted $30. He put the bills in the inner pocket of his coat and buttoned the pocket flap. $30. He had been a farmer for 32 years. He had grown corn and tobacco and kept a kitchen garden and raised hogs and had good years and bad in roughly the proportion that farming allows, which is to say, more bad than good, but not so many bad ones running together that you couldn't keep going. He had never done anything outside the law except the whiskey. And the whiskey he had started not from any love of criminality, but from a simple shortage of options, and from a conviction, which he held without drama, as a plain fact, that a law written by people who had plenty to eat and drink had no particular authority over a man who did not. He was not a political man. He had never joined anything or marched for anything or signed his name to anything except the bank note, the marriage certificate, and the deed to the land. His opinions about prohibition were not philosophical. They were practical. The whiskey he made was good whiskey. It harmed no one in the making. The man who bought it was a grown man who had sought it out. The money it brought was the difference between keeping the land and losing it. He could not see where the harm was. He had tried to find it, honestly, more than once. He kept arriving at the same conclusion. This was not the reasoning of a man who had not thought about it. It was the conclusion of a man who had thought about it carefully and arrived at a view he could live inside. He was living inside it. He stepped back into the boat. He did not push off immediately. He had time. The return crossing was better made after 1 a.m, when the steamer traffic was less, and the river patrols, if there were any, had settled into the long, quiet middle of the night. It was not yet midnight. He pulled the boat tight on the bar and tied the bowline to a root and walked up the bank onto the Ohio shore. He was not going anywhere particular. He wanted to stand on solid ground for a few minutes and let his back unknot itself. He stood at the edge of the tree line and looked downstream. 8 miles to Cincinnati, and you could not see it. But you could see what it made of the overcast above. A soft orange stain against the clouds, diffuse and steady. The glow of 10,000 electric lights gathered into one bloom of color on the sky. He had never been in a city after dark. He had seen photographs. He understood that Cincinnati was full of people living in ways he could not fully picture. Men who worked in offices, rode streetcars, ate in restaurants, read the evening paper while their wives put the dishes away. He did not envy them specifically. He envied them in the aggregate, abstractly, the way you might envy weather in a different county that is not as hard as yours. His $30 was in his coat pocket. Their $30 came from salaries paid every 2 weeks regardless of rain. He stood there for a few minutes more and then turned and walked back down to the boat. He was a Kentucky man, and the Ohio shore was a foreign country to him in the way that any shore is foreign to a man who belongs to the other one. He did not dislike the Ohio shore. He simply did not belong to it. He sat on the gunwale and looked at the river and listened to it until the time felt right. He checked the boat's trim before pushing off. There was nothing in the hull now except his own weight and the oars and the coiled bowline, and it sat 3 inches higher than it had on the crossing over. He felt the difference as he walked it out from the bar. A loaded boat moves predictably. An empty boat in crossing, current wants to go its own way. He had been thinking about the return crossing since before he left Kentucky. This was how he managed what other men might call fear, by thinking through each part of it in advance, seeing the problems before they arrived, so that when they came, they were already known things and not surprises. He was not a man who liked surprises. Ruth had called this quality caution. He had called it preparation. They were probably the same thing named differently. He got in and took the oars and pushed away from the bar with one oar and settled into the rowing position. He angled upstream first, working against the bank current, staying close to the Ohio shore, until he had enough angle to give the crossing current room to carry him without pushing him too far below his landing on the Kentucky side. The night was very still. The fog had thinned while he was on the bar, and he could see stars in places now. He could see the Kentucky shore as a clear, dark line across the water. He began the crossing. He rowed with the same long, even strokes as before, keeping the blades quiet, keeping his breathing steady. The stars shifted slowly past the bow as the crossing current worked against his angle. He corrected without thinking, leaning into the stroke on the right, easing on the left, keeping the Kentucky tree line where it needed to be. The river was doing what it always did. He was doing what he always did. Between the two of them, they would work it out. He saw the lantern when he was 2/3 of the way across. It was on the Kentucky bank, moving. Not fast, walking pace, along the bank upstream from his landing. A single lantern, uncovered, burning free. Not a riverman's lantern. A riverman moving at night along the bank carries a covered light, or no light at all. A man carrying an open lantern along a dark riverbank at midnight was either a man who did not care who saw him, or a man who wanted to be seen. Eldon stopped rowing. He let the oars drag and watched. The lantern moved upstream for perhaps 100 yards and stopped. He could make out the shape of a man behind it, standing at the top of the bank. The man was not looking at the river. He appeared to be looking upstream, along the bank. Revenue agents worked in pairs. This was something Eldon knew from men who had been caught and men who had barely not been. One man carries the light. The other stands back in the dark and watches what the light flushes out. A simple method. It worked, he drifted. The current was taking him downstream, and he did not correct it. He let himself go past his landing, past the screen of willow growth, past the downed sycamore that marked the entrance to his cove. He let himself drift another 200 yards below his landing until the lantern was well upstream, and its light no longer reached him. Then he pulled quietly for the bank. He came in onto a mud flat below an overhang of roots and cut earth. He stepped out without splashing and dragged the boat up into the roots and pressed himself against the bank and stayed still upstream. The lantern had stopped moving. It held in one place for a long time. Then it moved again, slowly. Then it went out. He waited. He waited 40 minutes by the feel of it. He sat under the root overhang in the mud of the bank with the river at his feet and watched the place where the lantern had been. Nothing came. After what felt like 40 minutes, he stood up carefully and moved along the bank in the dark, going upstream toward his landing. The bank was treacherous going, steep in places, cut by small ravines where spring floods had eaten the earth away, overgrown with willow and river birch that grabbed at him as he pushed through. He moved slowly and used his hands as much as his eyes. He felt the damp clay underfoot and the cold of the water-saturated ground soaking through his boots. He was wet to the knee from getting out of the boat, and the cold was settling into him the way river cold does, starting at the extremities and working in toward the core of the body. He found the fallen sycamore by feel and used it to orient himself and climbed the bank to the shelf where his boat normally sat. The canvas was there, folded as he had left it. He went up further to where the mule was tied. Cobb was still there. He could hear the mule breathing before he saw it. He did not go back for the boat that night. The boat was down the bank in the root overhang, and getting it back to the cove in the dark, past a place where there may or may not still be men with intent, was not a risk worth taking. The boat was old and unremarkable, and could sit under the bank for a few days without harm. He stood beside the mule and put one hand on its neck. The mule smelled of hay and warm animal. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's go." He walked the mule back through the timber rather than riding, because the track was uneven in the dark, and the mule was 15 years old, and he didn't need a fall on top of everything else. They moved through the bottom timber at the pace the dark allowed, which was slow, and he held the lead rope loose and let the mule find its own footing. This was something he had learned about old animals. They know their own feet better than you do, and the best thing you can do for them in bad ground is leave them alone to use what they know. He thought about the lantern on the bank. He did not know for certain it had been a revenue agent. It could have been a farmer checking something along the river, a fisherman, any man with a reason to be on a riverbank at midnight. But it had not felt like any of those things. It had felt like a man looking for something, moving with the particular deliberateness of someone who has information and is acting on it. Someone had talked, or someone had seen something and added things up and mentioned it. In a county of 6,000 people, things got mentioned. He was not a social man and did not talk about his business, but he bought grain and copper fittings and corn sugar, and a careful man might notice these things over time. He had thought about this before. He thought about it now more carefully. He would not make another crossing until spring. He had enough money now, or close enough, to manage through the winter if he was careful. He would sell the mule. He had been thinking about this, and the thinking had arrived at a conclusion somewhere in the middle of the river on the way back. The mule would go at the Augusta autumn sale, and the $60 or so he would get for it would close enough of the gap. He would take the warehouse work in Brooksville through November. He would come in under the December deadline. He said this to himself in the dark, the way you say things when you are alone and tired, without full conviction, but with the intention of conviction. He would see. His father's name had been Harold Marsh, and he had been a man of particular certainties. He believed that a man should own land, that the ownership of land was the only real security available to a man without education or money or connections, and that any sacrifice required to maintain that ownership was justified. He had said this in those words, or close to them, more than once. He had not been a cruel man, exactly, but he had been a man with a fixed idea, and fixed ideas make a person seem harder than they are. Harold had paid off the land in 12 years of tobacco farming and hog raising, and working winters at the lumber mill in Augusta. He had not borrowed money after the original purchase. He lived within what the farm produced, and when it produced too little, he worked outside. And when outside work was scarce, he made the household smaller in whatever ways were possible. He had owned the land free and clear when he died in 1919, and he had left it to Eldon without debt and without conditions attached. Eldon had borrowed against it in 1923 when the frost took the tobacco crop, and he needed cash to carry the farm through the following spring. He had known his father would not have made that decision. He had also known that his father's refusal to borrow had cost the family in other ways: winters of eating badly, shoes worn past wearing, his mother's medicine unfilled when she was sick. The absence of debt is not the same as the presence of comfort. He had thought about his father tonight on the river, lying flat in the hull while the steamboat passed over the water above him. He had thought about what his father would say about what he was doing out here. He had a fairly clear idea of what his father would say. He had not found the imagined opinion useful. His father had lived in a time when you could make enough on 41 river bottom acres to pay your way through a bad year. That time was different from now. The world had changed the arithmetic. Eldon had not been able to change it back. He came out of the timber at the barnyard fence as the first suggestion of gray appeared in the east, not light yet, just the first thinning of the black above the ridge to the east, the sky beginning to separate itself from the darkness below it. He let Cobb through the gate and led the mule to the barn and put it in its stall and gave it water from the bucket and a measure of grain, more than usual. The mule had been out all night and had behaved well. He believed in acknowledging that. He stood in the barn for a while after the mule was settled. The barn smelled of hay and manure and old wood and the cold that had collected in it through the night. Not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of a working farm, which is the smell of something real and ongoing and his. He took the $30 from his inside coat pocket and moved it to the breast pocket of his overalls, which had a button on the flap. He had kept money in that pocket for 20 years. It was where money went. He did the arithmetic again, not because it would change, but because doing it gave him something to work on while he stood in the dark barn, letting his hands warm up. The tin under the bedroom floorboard held $112. Add tonight's 30, and he had 142. He needed 340. The mule at the autumn sale would bring 60, maybe 65. That was 202 to 207. He needed 133 more by December 15th. 11 weeks, $12 a week, working steadily. The Brooksville warehouse was paying 40 cents an hour for seasonal labor. 30 hours a week, he could do that. He went out of the barn and crossed the barnyard to the house. The field to the east of the house showed first as a gray shape, and then as a thing with texture. The ridged rows of harvested corn stubble, frost-edged, running down to the tree line at the south end of the property. He walked through it without particularly meaning to, crossing from the barnyard through the gate at the corner, and along the east field fence line, the way he sometimes did in the early morning when the light was coming and the world was quiet. He walked to the south end of the field and stood at the fence and looked at the trees. They were mostly bare. You could see through them to the slope of the hill beyond where the Hadley farm began, and beyond that to the dark shape of the Hadley house against the pale sky. James Hadley had lost his farm in March. The bank in Brooksville had taken it for a debt of $220, which was less than Eldon owed. Hadley had been a good farmer, better than Eldon in some respects, more methodical, more organized with his records. It had not mattered. The bank was not interested in his methods. Hadley and his wife and their 2 daughters were living now in a rented house in Brooksville. He worked at the feed store. The daughters went to the school in town. It was not a catastrophe in the way that true catastrophes are catastrophes. They ate. They were housed. But Hadley had been a farmer and was not one now. And when Eldon had seen him at the Augusta post office in July, the man had looked like something transplanted from its native ground, waiting to find out whether it would take root somewhere else or not. Eldon looked at the dark Hadley house for a while. Then he turned and walked back up through the field toward his own house, which still had smoke coming from the chimney, and still had a light in the kitchen window, and still sat on 41 acres that were still, for now, his. He passed the kitchen garden on the way to the back door. Ruth had planted it when they were first married, and he had maintained it every year since she died, not because he had any particular skill at kitchen gardens, but because it was hers, and letting it go would be a different kind of loss than losing her. Smaller, but more avoidable. He grew what she had grown: onions, potatoes, dried beans, a row of sage and thyme at the south end, and in summer a section of tomatoes that always did better than he expected. He did not eat tomatoes much. He grew them because she had, and because something in him could not stop. The garden was done for the year. He had pulled the last of it in October, before this trip. The beds were turned and bare, the frost working at the edges, leaving the earth crumbly and gray in the early light. In spring, he would turn them again and put in the onion sets and the potato halves. And in June, the tomato plants he would start in coffee tins on the kitchen windowsill. This was the cycle. He knew it the way you know a dance you have done 1,000 times in the body without thought. He had thought many times about what it would mean to not have this garden, to not have the view from the kitchen window across the beds to the cornfield beyond, to not have the smell of turned earth in May, or the smell of tomato plants on his hands in late July. He had thought about it and could not make it feel real. It was the same problem as thinking about Ruth not being here. You could arrange the thought, but you could not feel its full weight until the thing was true. And by then, the thinking was no longer the point. He opened the back door and went into the kitchen. The kitchen was cold. He had let the fire go out before he left the previous evening, not wanting smoke from the chimney to be visible while he was away for the night. He built a fire now with dry wood from the box and crumpled newspaper, and the good pine kindling that Ruth had always kept split small and dry, the pieces that caught fast and burned hot and had you from cold to warm in a few minutes. The fire caught on the second match. He shut the stove door and put the coffee pot on and sat at the kitchen table. The table sat at the angle Ruth had placed it to catch the morning light. The light was coming now, thin and pale, through the east window, falling across the oilcloth. He put his hands flat on the table. His hands were large and dark with old work, and they had the roughness specific to hands that have been in water and dirt and cold for 30 years. He looked at them the way you look at familiar things when you are very tired, not for any reason, only because they are there and they are yours, he heard the coffee beginning to work in the pot. The sound of a percolating coffee pot in a cold kitchen in the early morning is one of the more reliable sounds in the world. He was tired in the particular way that comes from a night of sustained attention rather than physical labor. The body was not deeply worked. The mind had been working all night, reading the river, watching for light, waiting, calculating. That kind of tiredness sits differently. Physical tiredness is clean. It wants sleep and food. This other kind is murkier. It wants to be done with itself. He poured the coffee and drank it standing at the stove. Then he refilled the cup and took it to the table and sat down in the thin early light and held it in both hands. He was done with the river for this season. He was certain of this now, or near enough to certain. He went upstairs after the second cup. The bedroom was cold in the way upstairs rooms are cold in old farmhouses in October, when the heat from below has not yet reached that far. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled up the loose board under the right side of the bed frame and took out the tin. The tin had been a biscuit tin once, from a company in Louisville that had gone out of business in 1919. The lid was tight. He opened it on his lap. Inside was the money saved through the summer bills of various sizes, some rolled, some flat, a few coins. He counted it, $112.40. He took the $30 from his breast pocket and added it to the tin and counted again, $142.40. He looked at the number for a while. It was not a satisfying number. It was a number that needed other numbers added to it before it would feel like anything. But it was larger than it had been yesterday. And yesterday, it had been larger than before the summer. This was the direction. Direction matters more than position. A man moving towards something is in a different condition than a man standing still at the same distance from it, and Eldon had understood this for a long time. Not as a philosophy, as a plain fact about what keeps a man going. He put the lid back on the tin and replaced it under the board and pressed the board flat. He lay back on the bed without taking his boots off. He would sleep 2 hours. There were chores at 7. Cobb needed feeding, the chickens letting out. The south field fence had posts leaning that needed looking at before winter settled in. 2 hours, and then he would get up and do those things. He closed his eye. His glass eye was already closed, as it always was when he lay down, the lid resting over nothing, undisturbed. He closed the real one. The river sound was not in his head. He had expected it to be there. It was quiet. He slept. He woke at 6:45, which was 5 minutes before he meant to. He lay still on top of the covers in the cold room and looked at the ceiling, the white pine boards he had nailed up there in 1904, which had darkened with years and smoke to the color of old honey. He had looked at those boards a great many mornings. He would look at them a great many more. He sat up and put his feet on the floor. His boots were still on, which he registered without particular feeling. He had slept in his boots before. He went downstairs and put wood in the stove and put the leftover coffee on to reheat and went out the back door into the morning. The sky was high and pale blue above the ridge, sharp the way October sky is sharp when the air is clean and cold and no weather is coming. The frost on the corn stubble was bright in the early light, each crystal distinct. His breath made smoke in the cold air. He walked across the barnyard and opened the barn and let the chickens out. They came out into the morning complaining and scattered across the barnyard with their usual urgent purposelessness. He filled Cobb's water bucket and grain trough. The mule ate without looking at him. He latched the barn door and stood in the barnyard in the early light. The farm was all around him. The house, the barn, the outbuildings, the field, the tree line to the south, and beyond it and below it, and not visible from here, but known as well as the lines of his own hand. The river, $340, due December 15th. 142 in the tin. The mule to sell. Work to find. 11 weeks. The arithmetic was clear, and the arithmetic was not comfortable, but it was possible. It had a path through it. The land was his. He went inside and drank his coffee and put on his coat and went back out to begin the work of the day. Outside, the frost was burning off the corn stubble in the rising sun, each acre of it catching the light and releasing it. The cold giving back what it had taken in the night. The field going from white to gray to the deep, particular brown of October river bottom land in Kentucky. The color his father had called the best color in the world, and which Eldon, standing in it in the morning, after the longest night in recent memory, found he still agreed with. Thank you for watching to the end. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye, my friends.